So let's get started. I think Eirik was the first to think about asking if there are any announcements, and then I always, when I ask, then I follow up with my own. But are there any other announcements anyone wants to make? Yes.
Opening in Evergreen Gallery tomorrow, 5 to 7 p.m. 5 student photographers, and then I think right after that there's an opening in the student art gallery in the Capitol. So Thursday night art night.
Yeah.
And Thursday noon is Art Noon, okay? At noon in Lecture Hall 5, Lionel Grant, who's a Maori sculptor and artist and designer who's in residence currently at the Lawn House, is doing the reading studio for the Indigenous Arts Campus. Lionel will be talking about his work as a designer and sculptor, and at noon in Lecture Hall 5, and yeah, and his work using computers and digital technology. That's at noon tomorrow, Lionel Grant, Lecture Hall 5.
Thanks. Anyone else?
And then June 10th is going to be the media work screening. There'll be flyers up soon.
Thanks, Kelsey. So we can keep announcing that, because we have, even though we're all sort of working up for the year-end projects, we still have, after today, 2 more art lectures. So to keep your minds outside of just your own work, we have more people coming to keep inspiring you and getting you to think in new ways. So next week is Amjad Fowler from our own faculty, and then week 10 is Cassie Thornton, who will be a really interesting artist. So please keep coming through the end. Today we have Stephen Hendricks, our very own, and Cecil Flores will introduce Stephen.
Can you hear me? Okay. It is my distinct pleasure to introduce today's speaker and my professor, Stephen Hendricks. We are very fortunate to say that he is truly one of our own. He is both a member of the faculty here at Evergreen and an Evergreen alum. In no particular order, Stephen is a writer, professor, practicing bookbinder, book artist, and letterpress printer. He teaches writing, literature, and book arts, formally speaking, but he has taught me many things beyond those disciplines. Very interestingly, he has a fiery chili pepper rating for hotness on ratemyprofessors.com. Originally from Omaha, Nebraska, Stephen journeyed west to attend Evergreen and went on to receive an MFA in writing from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago in 2000. His writing has appeared in the Denver Quarterly, Web Conjunctions, Fold the Reader, the Encyclopedia Project Volume 2, Sidebrow, and at XCP. In 2014, he published his debut novel, Little Is Left to Tell, with Starcherone Books. It's always hard for me to say. I will leave him to tell you more about that project, but a lovely book trailer video introduction of the novel can be found at stephenhendricks.com. And you can also read the first chapter of the book at brooklynrail.com. Of his book, our own Miranda Mellis says, "Little is left to tell stands on its own haunches, a powerful meditation on the real and the imaginary, consciousness and family, interspecies, friendship, and the imbrications of animal and human experience in the landscape torn apart by violence. The book asks, where do violence and wisdom come from? What will trauma and loss require of the imagination in order for beings, animal, human, animal, to live onward?" Of his own writing, Stephen says, "I'm interested thematically and formally in the failure of stories. It's from a love of stories and discomfort with stories that I wrote the book. And the blend of genres, the fragmenting and shifting of the text is my own effort to make meaning without making sense, to create an imaginative space for the reader to wander, to be playful." This is what Stephen does best in the classroom as well, creating imaginative spaces for students to wander and be playful, making meaning without always making sense. This quarter in calculated fiction, Stephen has taught me to appreciate the exciting, sparky nature of program texts crushing up against each other. In class, he's introduced me to Borges, Beckett, Janke, and Tom McCarthy, and helped me develop a palette for fiction that is both discerning and fluid. In class, we critically and associatively generate terms and concepts which bounce off of our readings, sometimes illuminating them, sometimes confusing them. I've lost touch with the meaning of words like literature, fiction, fantasy, novel, plot, and I like it. His assignments are like labyrinths. They are the best part of a choose-your-own-adventure book with stimulating questions and plenty of room to play. One of my favorite Stephen quotes from class is, "There's something paranoid about plot." I'm honored to have had the pleasure to introduce him to you. We're lucky to have him at Evergreen. Please help me warmly welcome Stephen.
Thank you for that embarrassing and thoughtful introduction. So great. That sets a great tone for what I'm going to be talking about. I'm going to tell you sort of a bait and switch story, but nonetheless what I think is a coherent story about the emergence of this novel that was published last year by Star Jerome. And bait and switch because I'm going to wander through some of my interest in book arts and where, for me, that intersects with writing and literature in a general way. But there's a kind of disappointment was a strange path that I traveled, maybe mostly a pragmatic path where this work might have become something highly visual, highly sculptural, but became something that looks like a book, right? Like a conventional novel. And I'm okay with that, but because I also raised a couple kids and all that kind of jazz. And it's easier to raise kids while writing than while making. Right? Making takes a lot more time, space, and concentration. So yeah, I'm going to tell kind of a long story and try to talk pretty quickly through some of my sort of phases of writing this work. And it's a long story because I did start it about 20 years ago, which I think is probably too long to spend on a novel. But then again, there are already a lot of novels out there, so why crank them out, right? So part of the length is interesting to me too, as a sense of what novels can be or should be, which is not really to say anything about the quality of my work, but to say something about its form, something about what it means to me, and I think I'll talk more about that later. But the story for me begins right about 20 years ago here at Evergreen. And it begins, I think, with my frustration with trying to learn writing in college, trying to study writing, trying to think about being a writer. And finding right away, one of the great things about Evergreen, of course, is finding that other disciplines were telling me more about writing than the seeming discipline of writing. Which is to say, I found myself encountering in writing workshops things like common fiction writing mistakes and how to avoid them. Which felt really, I don't know, boring, I guess, which felt really out of touch with other ideas about artistic process or artistic practice or the role of art in society, felt really out of touch with the things that turned me on in literature, which are things like work by Virginia Woolf or James Joyce or Samuel Beckett, things that you know, if you think about getting really hooked on something in high school that's really wild, like maybe William Burroughs or something, and you tell your creative writing teacher, what about this? What about this? They say, well, you're no William Burroughs, right? And that's sort of true. Well, maybe good, right? But nonetheless, it's a weird answer. Like when we have these exceptional works of literature around us and we can't seem to learn anything from them, and the whole discipline of writing seems geared towards producing a commodity, right? Something that will work in a marketplace. So it's really frustrated by that, and I didn't know what the alternative was. And I found some kind of alternative in thinking about visual arts and beginning to practice some visual arts while here at Evergreen. And then two things that I encountered finally kind of gave me other avenues of inquiry. The first was literary theory, and particularly the kind developed by Roland Barthes and other French people. And I'll give you this. This was a line in an essay by Roland Barthes about a work by Philippe Soler called in English Event, called in French Drame. And the story is the desire for the story. Roland Barthes' claim about the Soler novel, or book, text, whatever you want to call it, is that it doesn't contain a story, it doesn't contain a novel, that everything in the novel is unfolding in the act of writing, in the moment of writing, and that the act of writing is its entire drama, is its event. And so it's kind of this pulling together of the idea of writing into this moment of engagement with language and with the page, perhaps in some sense, with the process. And this kind of thinking sparked me quite a bit, because I was trying to figure out what writing meant without all of this other stuff on top of it, without all this stuff about character development and plot development, and story was kind of the kind of a strong marker for what was wrong with that. This sort of religious adherence to this idea of a story, right? We've got to have a story. Where's the story? And yet no capacity to say what that meant or what that object story is or what it's for. So I was interested in ways that Soler and Barthes and other thinkers were kind of breaking these things down and looking for other ways to think about the act of writing and the art of writing that weren't about sort of already very familiar practices. Right? At the same time, and something I'll talk a bit more about, I encountered letterpress printing and the book arts, and this brought me into a whole other way of thinking about myself as not even being a writer anymore, but being a maker of books, right? And that appealed to me on two levels. One, the level of being an artist and dealing with text, words as visual things, as text and words as interacting with imagery, and also in thinking about what it means to be a writer without a form in which to write other than the book itself, right? So the book in this vein is not necessarily the ideal container for a text, and the book, we could say, doesn't really care about what you're writing, right? The book doesn't. This doesn't. You know, when you to get there, I think we can think like, and we've brushed against this in class, like what is a novel, right? A novel is longer than a novella, right? It has a kind of length to it, right? That's the only real structure we sort of hold on to with the idea of novel, that it has length. And so a book is a similar thing. It's an object in which you can put words if you want. How you put them in there or what they're doing in there is undetermined, right? So the book itself creates for the writer, I think, a very sort of a kind of neutral, unassuming space in terms of literary ideas or literary values, and yet a visual space that has structure and possibility the way a blank canvas does, right? So, a couple other things. This is another kind of image. Should I turn the lights down a little bit? I will have slides, but mostly because it's so boring to just watch someone talk. And especially when I'm reading, I'll read some parts of the novel, and that is like deadly, right? No one wants to sit through that. But I think you're a sturdy bunch. I will read a little bit more than I might otherwise. But you will be bored, so you'll have to have something to look at and something to do. And this might be the one art lecture where, like, if you fall asleep, that's okay with me, right? This is what stories are for, right? Putting people to sleep. So, relax. So this is a palimpsest, right? Great little word, palimpsest. The idea or the image of it, the word comes from the practice of writing on actual flesh, right? Prepared flesh, which has a kind of cost to it, right? You got to kill something to get it. So if you decide, well, I don't like what I wrote on there, or I don't have a lot more sheep around or goats, you rather than killing another goat, You just scrape off the top layer, right? You just start scraping away and pull off some of the ink from the old writing, and then you can write something over top of it. And of course, the scraping away is imperfect, so you have these sort of faded ghosts of past text underneath. And for me, it's a nice image of a certain way of thinking about fragments, a certain way of thinking about creative process, and even a certain way of thinking about the reading experience. That in reading a text, we don't remember all the words, but we form some kind of ghost of the words, right? That follows us into the next part of the text and the next, right? So there's something about this sort of image, and this sort of image too, being associated with kind of bookiness, textiness, and all this stuff that draws me and helps me to continue thinking about what it means to have a book that is full of what might be regarded as fragments or broken pieces or unfinished pieces or pieces that are, in a sense, kind of discarded in favor of others. And that's kind of what's in the novel. So thinking about that as layers, as ghosts, as movements through time over a single surface is interesting to me. And the fact that it comes from this use of flesh in writing is appropriately gruesome, I suppose. One more thing to say, I guess, and well, this is maybe the next version of a sort of sexiness of the book world. Like palimpsests are books that contain other people's notes, right? I've never met anyone who doesn't have a certain affection for marginalia, and especially when you can connect to it some other way. This is a book of my grandmother's, my mother's mother, and she was sort of obsessive about writing in books that she was reading, slipping in pieces of paper with notes, filling up the end pages with quotations from the book itself, so kind of, creating her own little appendix of favorite bits and pieces, her own little kind of commonplace book fragments. This is a part of the genesis of this novel is a story that, like, if I tell it to you, you might think, oh, that's what the novel's about. And then if you read the novel, you think, what? How is that not in there? The personal story that kind of drove me on. And I think a lot of writing, a lot of art comes from this kind of story of maybe it's about pain, but I think it's more about kind of things that we don't know that we think we should know, or absences in our lives, or missing pieces, or things too complicated to understand. And this is one of them. So when I was about 11 or 12, I'd never met my grandmother, my mother's mother. I had met all of my father's extended family, and they were not like me, right? Or not like who I thought I was or wanted to be, right? So I saw them as kind of these strange people mostly from Texas. I didn't identify with them and their lives very much. So I figured, well, there must be some connection in my mother's family. And yet most of her family was gone. Her mother, by the time I was 11 or 12, her mother was suffering from Alzheimer's, such that she didn't really know who we were, who she was. And my mother's brother, I found out at some point. So my mother's brother had always been one of these voids, this thing that I didn't know about but thought I should and really wanted to. And I wanted that sense of like, well, maybe that's someone who I come from, right? And I have his name as my middle name, David. And so I had this fantasy connection with this guy who was gone. And as a kid, you don't know why someone would be gone, except that they must have somehow gotten really old and died. But the timing wasn't right for that. I was always really curious about him. So meeting my grandmother for me meant she arrived at a nursing home where we lived, and all of her books and her piano and a bunch of other stuff arrived in our basement. And so this was sort of finally my sense of access to family, right, to a lineage. Knowing my grandmother through her books, through these kinds of obsessive notes and marginalia, and her kind of spiritual endeavors, investigating Buddhism and Zen and mystical Christian cultish things. Whoa, what's going on? Much later in life then is when I also found out, after already kind of obsessing about this grandmother and this missing uncle, at some point, not even not until about 10 years ago did I find the full story, but find out that my uncle had committed suicide as a very young man. And that became kind of wrapped up in how I was trying to explore who he was and in what ways I could see him as an ancestor. Right? So that's that. So with this sort of unknown, with in my life that I'm playing over, that I'm kind of making up stories to surround or to think about, and with this orientation towards the book as this neutral space and writing as this thing that also, I mean, imagine well, what I would think to myself is what should I not be doing, right? As I think about my grandmother, as I think about my dead uncle, what should I not be doing? Well, I should not be taking possession of their lives as if I own them, as if I can know them, as if I can solve their problems, as if I can understand suicide, as if I can understand the experience of Alzheimer's. I shouldn't be making them into something that I want or need. I shouldn't be claiming their story as my own to tell, right? So how can I move into that space, move into those stories without betraying them, without overwhelming them with what I wish for or anything like that. So these were things on my mind, kind of, I guess, aesthetically or in terms of narrative possibilities. As I said, though, I got into this visual stuff. This is a book I made here at Evergreen, I think as a junior, my first real book project. This is the cover at the end. It started as playing with computer stuff and text and this weird kind of internal text space and external marginalia space and trying to figure all that out. And then I encountered Letterpress, which is this hand-set metal type process, which really freaked me out and got me excited. The idea of holding a little letter in your hand, the idea that writing is this kind of weighty activity of putting every single letter in place, right? It's a good editing tool, right? You really think about what words you're using and which ones you need. And what started as this kind of goofiness became something I think, this is how it looks when it's kind of set, became this, which was a lot more playful. This play with typography was really exciting for me. This way of thinking differently about what a text had to do on the page, how it might tell a story, how it might exist, not even as story, but just as text becoming image, was super, super exciting for me. I was also inspired by folks like Stefan Melarmay. This is a one-page spread from his major work called Ankuta, written near the end of the 19th century. And it's sort of, been sort of a touchstone, I think, for a lot of artists and poets. Interesting things about it are that not all the pages look like this. Some have just kind of clusters of text in very small spaces. You can kind of read it down and then down, but you also kind of have to look across the gutter and see what's happening between different phrases. The space around the phrases or the space around the words becomes kind of activated when they become sort of loosened from grammar to some degree. Melarmay, all of Melarmay's works have kind of bizarre contortions of interesting grammatical formations, and this is kind of the extreme of that because you can play out different grammatical possibilities. The words and the phrases being kind of isolated kind of gives them this way of reaching out, almost like when you read a phrase, it has all these different tendrils that might grab onto other phrases. So you have about 12 page spreads like this, different formations, different patterns, and just on its own, a kind of complex, difficult poem, even without all the visual play. I'm working with this text now in a new project as well, and here's some notes from Johanna Drucker, also someone who really inspired me when I was younger, talking about Melarmay. A book had the capacity to use its form, she's paraphrasing Melarmay, to establish some nameless system of relationships. This could not happen without attention, a self-conscious act by which the text becomes integral with its placement, movement, symphonic orchestration through the space of the book. Right. So Melarmay really was doing something kind of wild with this novel. In one sense, it might seem totally kind of unhinged. But Melarmay didn't want things to be unhinged. He was also a very structured poet. He kind of thought free verse was kind of lame. He wasn't into free verse. He was into finding different structures for verse, finding different ways of patterning. And so the poem, even though it might look pretty wild and free, also contains sort of a high degree of structuring, a high degree of patterning that you can kind of dissect and play within, right? In any case, this movement through the book, this idea that the book has space, visual space, sculptural space, was really exciting for me. Here's something I played with just because across a page you can move these texts into each other in different ways. There's a whole theme visually and in the text of waves and of a maelstrom, a kind of storm at sea and a sinking ship. And so I thought, well, what if there are other ways to connect the text, not just across a single page spread, but multiple pages kind of attaching to each other that might form an interesting image. So one thing you can do with this poem, or I did with the poem anyway, is cut it all up into kind of these pages with the spaces removed, and played with how phrases across page spreads can connect and form a broader image and a different read through the whole book, which is not so interesting in itself, but maybe it's interesting as an expression of, again, like what happens when we read something, how our mind hooks onto phrases and images and ideas and carries them with us into a new page or into a new moment in the text. And this is maybe my way of working through how the poem reads in that sense, how it creates a kind of mental sculpture or a mental pattern that you can kind of feel if not know its sort of sense of wholeness, right? Anyway. Here's another bit. The spaces of the book could be invested with a far more complex structure and thus become the divine and intricate organism required by literature, a constellation of text. This phrase has always kind of intrigued me and puzzled me and delighted me, the divine and intricate organism required by literature. What would literature require? And why would it be an organism? And are we talking about the reader? Are we talking about the book? Are we talking about both in a kind of interchange? It's a beautiful kind of provocation, I think, on Melarmay's part. This is quoting him in that moment. And this idea of a constellation of text, that maybe this is to another way of not thinking about fragments, but thinking about constellations, right? Which we know are kind of, ephemeral tracings of kind of arbitrary connections, not necessarily between fragments of a whole that are somehow broken or somehow needing connection, but connections that are made actively, connections that are made imaginatively, not because we need to repair something, but because they're there, right? So constellation of text. I played with this in my own letterpress work, creating books, and here's one in particular, that have these sort of layers of different texts, and for me also as the maker, kind of layers of different processes. These large letters were printed on a massive Washington-style press. One of these big, like if you have any image in your head of Ben Franklin as a letterpress printer, this is his style of letterpress, like a big, crushy thing, huge bed. So the pleasure for me was laying out in this huge press bed these large letters and small letters, and the thing about letterpress is that it really wants you to do something very precisely organized and linear, right? So as soon as you stop doing that, you have a really complicated puzzle to work out, right? And that puzzle is really exciting and fun to play with. And so I had to do that in all these cases. But besides that, there's sort of a large text on these pages. There's small text. There's marginal text. There's texts that kind of interact with each other. I had a lot of fun with this because I guess I don't have the second page slide, but this text is completed by another page that has all the letters that have been dropped out of it, right? So you can put them back together and form a new set of gibberish in this case. But it's fun. Just move through these. Here's another play with kind of text and reformulating things through the space of the book. I took just one story by Italo Calvino, a one-page little bit about what he calls his invisible cities. These little vignettes about strange cities. This one is built on a net stretched between two mountain peaks. And so here I made a book where strings thread through the book and attach to words that are stitched onto the pages. The text is various permutations or mutations of Calvino's original text. grabbing things about the nouns or the verbs, or reordering things, or anagramming things. And then the book is also hooked into a metal ring structure so that all these strings can be pulled from the outside to kind of move the book around. I don't know why. So here, this is just this is me, very young, playing in a big, fat, wonderful notebook with nice, like, fancy Reeves printing paper, right? So you know Reeves. And the pleasure of writing in a different form than, say, on computer or in a lined notebook. This is me just kind of trying to be different in my writing process, not even to create something that works as a product in these various ways, but that just trying to write differently in order to get at some different forms of what it might mean to kind of work out language on paper. In any case, at some point, long ago, an earlier version of this novel now had incorporated some of these ideas back into sort of a conventional novel form, something I could do easily in a conventional book. And here, what I got interested in is the way that I could use the page spread and use the book, the open book surface as a kind of theater for voices, right? So throughout this version, the left-hand page spread has one kind of continuous run through the book, and the right-hand page spread follows another continuous run through the book. And then they're also kind of, they kind of play off against each other at various moments, and not exactly in a responsive way as if it's dialogue, but just a kind of concurrent way with different typefaces kind of being different voices that, on the respective pages. Here's something from Solaire. I might just kind of zip through this because I want to get on a bit. But oh, I'm sorry. This is Bart again talking about Solaire. He says the I, the personal pronoun of the classical first-person narration, is based on a split personality. The I is the author of two different actions separated in time. The first action consists of living. The second consists of writing it down. Solaire takes the two traditional halves, the narrator and the subject of the action, joined together by the equivocal I, and makes them into a single performer. This is that same novel where the story is the desire for the story, where the act of writing becomes the writing, right? And this is how Bart sees this conjoining into a performer, the sort of dual or multi-personality of the author conjoining into a single performer in the act of writing. His narrator is entirely absorbed in one single action, that of telling the story. The act of telling the story, which is transparent in the impersonally narrated novel and ambiguous in the first-person narrative, has become visible and opaque, taking up the whole stage. So this speaks to my own sense of trying to create the novel as an event itself, as a multi-voiced thing happening on the page, rather than a thing representing some other kind of dream world or other space. So I was really interested throughout this drafting process and several versions of the novel in the artificiality of novelistic techniques, the artificiality of the situation of writing, and trying to get at moments of that event of writing, that act of writing as lively, playing with well, since I had, part of my inspiration being these notes from my grandmother, right? Playing with the interaction between notes and responses to notes, marginalia and primary text, all those things as events that happen in books. So it goes. So I wrote several drafts of that novel, finished it several times, and then moved on, right? I scrapped it maybe 6 years ago or so and started over. I didn't know I was starting over at the moment, but I quickly found out that I'd started over. What I thought I was going to do was write a short story version of it. Just say, screw the novel, write a short story. And I thought, well, what does that demand? It demands compression. Demands kind of a singularity of kind of focus and time and everything. So I took this sort of sprawling thing, playing with all kinds of stuff, and just said, what could be the action that just brings all this together? What I had at the time was a character that was very kind of artificial in my mind, very much a kind of an object to move around, not a human. to sympathize with very much, called Mr. Finn, no other name or anything, and a character called David, who I was playing with in relation to my dead uncle. And they were both alive and well in my novel and doing various metafiction-y things. And there was also a character called the Story, and the Story was sort of a half-formed being that would hang around sometimes and do stuff and then avoid being captured, right? Mr. Finn really wanted to find that Story, but the Story wasn't sure it wanted to be found, because being found would also be kind of like being dead, right? So instead, this compression, this short story version, I said, well, okay, how about this? Now I'm thinking about my dead uncle, I'm thinking about my Alzheimer's grandmother. I sound very cold, I'm not, I'm just being flip. So what happens instead is one day Mr. Finn goes down to the shore, and there he sees the body of his son has returned to him, and he picks it up, takes it home, and waits for him to wake up. Right? So here we have old man losing some of his capacities, son having killed himself some time ago, finds his body, waits for it to come back. This became the new compression form, and instead of being a short story, it became the whole new rewrite of the novel. Along the way, I started integrating a bunch of other stories. So I got rid of this character, this story. It was keeping me in this kind of metafictional, ironic, kind of petulant, dismissive mode of thinking about narrative. And instead, what I realized was to make story an engaging conflict, the idea of story an engaging conflict, to create the tension between not knowing something and knowing something, I had to have stories, right? So I started that by integrating stories that other people had written. So I had some aspects of Old Man and the Sea, and now also Old Man of the Sea. The Old Man of the Sea is a character in the Odyssey who Menelaus, on the way back from Troy, finds. And when you find the Old Man of the Sea, if you can catch him and hold on to him, he's kind of a deity. He's the child of deities and father of someone, I forget. Anyway, if you catch him and hold on to him really tight, he'll start turning into all kinds of crazy stuff, like, fire, elephant, shark, tomato, camel, sponge. He'll turn into all this stuff trying to get you to let go, right? But if you hold on until he is exhausted, then you get to ask him questions and he'll answer, and he knows all the answers, I guess, right? So I started integrating that myth into the story. And for me, this turned into a sequence of moments, which I will read some to you now. And let's set the mood. Here's some text. This is actually what I'm looking at right now. It's like you're part of the action. So here we go. Mr. Finn woke in the middle of the night with an eye like a fish. It's gasping, slow, it's thrashing, nothing like a rhythm, nearing its end. No idea where the water was now. As it wriggled its way from his eye socket, he shoved it down against the deck with one hand. With the other, he grabbed a bottle of pills from the nightstand, popped the lid, and peeled out a single white pellet. For over an hour, the fish thought about the sea, periodically rousing itself, flexing its raw neck body, nature's rough draft of the spine. Mr. Finn ached and sagged as he waited for it to swim away. He gave up, dragged himself out of bed, and retreated to the study. There, his medicated mind could wander invisibly among books, especially those he'd read a number of times, taught with again and again, until the life of reading resembled a slow killing of the mind, he thought. Wandering some heath, he thought, in the ambience of beginnings and in the dross of my own ends. He saw that he was in his underwear and his button-down shirt, a sign that the division between days had been lost. He cracked a book and plucked out all the larger words with one eye, held them in his mind as a constellation. Oh, look at that. Let the lines be drawn and redrawn. Frightened gills pulsed against his temple. The fish thrashed again, an eye lunging out, flipping back. Reading hurt. No, reading was impossible. Mr. Crane, he said, What happened to the fish? Here's a pause. Mr. Crane is a rabbit version of Hart Crane the poet, who's not really there. Okay, good. He tried again. Back to bed, more pills. Sometime later, awake again, Mr. Finn wrapped his still aching self in its dressing gown and waddled, sour-mouthed, into his study to await a second medicinal dawn. Blurred around him were the ramshackle shelves of collected pulp and classic prose, leaning, bored mystics and symbolist poets stacked on each other's heads, bookended by crime novels, a dozen forgotten thrillers, a paper and glue nest of caved and rounded spines. At last his head accepted a chemical peace, and Mr. Finn wandered invisibly among the shelves. He spied a book and scanned his memory of it, turned it over in his mind, picked another, made sentimental clucks of his tongue, picked another, saying to himself, "The best authors are the architects of the mind, and the best writers are the barbarians." Such figures, he said out loud, the old man, Odysseus, are not characters in books. He lowered his voice, addressing his secret to the empty chair, but characters between books. He made a hand gesture to demonstrate, inhabiting the literary ether. And Mr. Finn, no, not that one. Go right to the end here. Mr. Finn woke with an eye like a sharp rock. Wordy, clamoring dreams smashed uselessly against the shore, eyelids washing in and out. The swollen, shabby roundness of his face surrounded the eye, stabbed through its green, grassy center, but nothing else. An island of cheek and jowl, no shoulders, chest, back, thighs, calves, heels, toes, no fingertips. He rolled and saw one arm was still there, not fully attached, but it made a bridge between the mattress and the nightstand, the hand gripping a bottle of pills. He let it go and it sank from view, the pills and nightstand too, all hidden below the tide. Everything could go, drawn in or sunken away, so that he was only the floating island, water lapping against him. And if his eye was a sharp rock, then it scribed the air, and if his mouth was a gaping harbor or inlet, then it had been carved by time and water, and said only that. Those are the first and last of 6 of these eye moments, this kind of ritual of Mr. Finn waking up with an eye like something else. And these throughout the novel are the transformations of the old man of the sea as his eye, right? Trying to, in a sense, outwit his own questions or strength or life, right? So here's a couple. Here I am now trying to figure out this new novel based on this new kind of opening gambit and new kinds of structures of integrating stories. This is my sloppy way of trying to figure things out, trying to map it, trying to see a structure in what I'm doing. At some point in trying to figure this thing out, I find another story that becomes a powerful component, a powerful kind of replacement of this, this metafictional story. And this is a French language primer published in the 50s. It was my mother's, called The Rabbits and the Mice. And we learn words, right? I should have brought, so what happens in this book is that we learn these little words, and one way we learn them is that these mice have gone to bed, and then their mother wakes them up screaming because there's a Zeppelin raid that's going to destroy their village, and they've got to get all their things, you know, like get your shoes, get your jacket, and the kids are like, are those my shoes? Where are my red gloves? So that we can learn some different words. And then their house explodes, and the mice are left alone in their front yard, and mother is gone. She's nowhere to be seen. Luckily, you see the Zeppelin up there, and the little mouse in the Zeppelin basket is throwing a letter down. So their mother, in the explosion, the mother was rocketed into the air. She landed in a Zeppelin basket, And now she has to cook and clean and do laundry for the bad guys, right? And someday she says she'll get back to her children, right? So she's like, you'll be okay. Go see. And then the mice have to go to the farm nearby where the cow's like, yeah, you can have my milk, and the goose is like, here's some eggs to eat, which is weird, right? It's getting darn route Kantian, right? So I enjoy that. I also enjoy. So it's the mice and the rabbits. I like rabbits better than mice. So my big originality gambit here was to change these mice into rabbits and then start telling the story. Luckily, my French wasn't great, so I could just kind of barely read the first few chapters and not really know what's going on, and then make up my own story from there on. My kids had these Playmobiles around, which are weird when you put them together. They don't belong to the same Playmobil sets, right? But here you have these animal rabbits and these anthropomorphized rabbits, which, I mean, you can only imagine what they're thinking with each other. And I figure, well, maybe that's part of growing up. Maybe they start as animal rabbits, and then eventually they're kind of more and more upright and start putting clothes on, which makes sense. So this is the first scene in the novel now. These rabbit stories expanded to include all kinds of other creatures, and it became the bedtime story that Mr. Finn had shared with his son and invented with his son in days of yore. Here it is. All the children of Mrs. Rabbit had been healthy and happy, their rooms tidy, clothing and toys arranged in their places, sheets pulled snug, waiting to hold their bodies in the night, pillows where they would rest their heads when the clock sang time for bed. Ball, comb, sock, doll, slipper, hat, lamp. Life had distributed the children a loving list of desires and objects that corresponded precisely, like the words and pictures in grammar books. While they danced or giggled or built with blocks in the house, Mother tended the garden, just in earshot of her little ones. She could stand from her work and see a few of them through the window. The light of the long summer evening reminded her of the peaches waiting in the kitchen. When the bombs fell, Mother ran for her children. Neighboring houses, crackling trees, the flat horizon itself became a vortex of slamming doors. She strained to focus on the tunnel of light and air between herself and her children, her feet dragging, nightmarish, through a blizzard of dirt and debris, her children lost in the clamor as her home disappeared. The rabbit children found each other in the morning when calm, clear air finally curled down from above and met the haggard earth. Lacing through the smoke and ash, the Zeppelin raid long concluded. They regarded each other and the world apprehensively, covered with filth, uncertain if they had truly lived. Eldest brother and eldest sister kept their eyes down, not wishing to see too much, dreading what could not be forgotten, while the littler bunnies limped and stumbled dumbly into the wrecked yard, expecting their confusion to lessen in the hours. Look at that. Eldest sister stopped and turned her eyes up. The sky is gone, she said. I can't look, said her brother, his body hunched and hunching. And they survive a bit, except for the eldest brother, as you can imagine. And then, of course, the mother does rescue them. Mother arrived from the air to rescue them. She said nothing, but her jaw worked like a vice to hold her heart inside as she saw them, went to them, gathered them. They were only capable of the slightest of grips about her shoulders, bodies filthy and fur in mats. Just the pink in their ears reflected the pumping joy in their hearts. They wanted to say something about those days and about their brother, but could not say a thing. They had left him where they'd found him, afraid to touch him, afraid to cover him over. The children were raised toward the clouds, 2 at a time, up a sinewy rope hung from the winged airship that had brought their mother. On the ground, she loaded sacks full of useful things from the ruins of her home. She hoisted the sacks up after the children into the open air for nearly half a mile, into the clouds, where long, white-furred arms worked the other end, whirling hand over hand to run the system of ropes and pulleys. The second eldest, now the eldest living bunny child, gazed up at the ship. It looked to her like a tremendous spider in the sky, the god of spiders, its many wooden arms extended in all directions, some of them forever, branching spontaneously into green leafy wings, vine-wrapped spinnakers, shoots and broad moonrakers full of wind, all glowing caterpillar greens in the high warm sun. She had never seen such a thing. Life would continue as a dream. So more mapping goes on, more figuring out what the heck I'm doing, printing the whole novel out on tiny pages to kind of get a broad kind of bird view. Is that what it's called? Bird view? Bird's eye, thank you. Bird view image. I'll bet birds can't even see that well. And more mapping. You can kind of see maybe it's forced, but my sense of it as I started seeing maps where things connected more and more, where more lines moved all over the place, made it start to seem like, oh, maybe this is working, right? Because what I've got here are lots and lots of fragments of stories. We don't really find out how each one finishes. We have numerous characters within the stories telling other stories. We have characters who are writers writing other stories, and we never get the whole full view of them, right? Instead, the stories kind of intersect and interact. Some might kind of speak to each other or be antitheses or complements to each other. But for me, writing it, what I wanted to do was keep avoiding the resolutions or the overarching structures that felt familiar or felt easy, right? You can come up with like here's the arc, and I can say, oh, now it's about this, now it's about this, now it's about this. And every time I would come up with a kind of solution to what the novel was doing, I would know that I didn't want to do that, right? Whatever it is, avoid that. Avoid the thing, in other words, that I can think of in advance, and keep pushing toward the things that I can't imagine, right, or can't think through rationally. So instead I have these fragments, and trying to figure out how they work means making these maps and seeing, okay, are there connections? And at some point when the connections are things that are, in reading it myself, I think, oh, like I didn't see that connection before. Maybe I should develop it. If I find that, oh, I already did develop it without even thinking about it, then I start to think, oh, maybe it's working. Maybe all these things are lacing together in a way that produces something interesting, something to play with, something to work with. And I'm a lover of the Samuel Beckett. And if it works, I have a moment here that explains the title of the novel. Oh, and it doesn't work. That's okay. I have a backup. This is a play titled Ohio Impromptu. It's Jeremy Irons and Jeremy Irons.
Little is left to tell. Little is left to tell. In a last attempt to obtain relief, he moved from where they had been so long together to a single room on the far bank. From its single window, he could see the downstream extremity of the Isle of Swans. Relief, he had hoped, would flow from unfamiliarity. Unfamiliar room, unfamiliar scene. Out to where nothing ever shared. Back to where nothing ever shared. From this he had once half hoped some measure of relief might flow. Day after day, he could be seen slowly pacing the islet, hour after hour, in his long black coat, no matter what the weather, an old-world Latin Quarter hat. At the tip, he would always pause to dwell on the receding stream. How in joyous eddies its two arms can flow and flowed united on, then turn, and his slow steps retrace. In his dreams,
So, what we have there is two identical actors. One who reads, it's about a 14-minute play. One who reads from this book, the other knocks to say stop and go back and repeat the line, and then knocks again to say, okay, continue. The scenario there appealed to me immediately because it felt just like what I had been trying to construct for Mr. Finn, this process of seeking relief, and not only kind of seeking relief and kind of in life, kind of moving to a place and having some peace and quiet, but this moment of relief and really grief being expressed as going back through this text. We get the impression in the play that every night this happens, this reading ritual, right? And so in my novel, this is drawn through these bedtime stories, these animal stories, as the thing that kind of possesses the space around Mr. Finn, and this thing, whatever it is, that he found at the beach, and becomes his way of kind of being alive and eventually being dead. That's what stories are. So here's not exactly a mapping out, but a way maybe for me to talk about some of the things that happen in the book. We have Mr. Finn, the old man and the sea, the old man of the sea. I like a fish, I like a bag of wind, I like a cloud, I like a church bell, I like a typewriter, I like a sharp rock that moves through the text. We have zeppelins and rabbits. The eldest zeppelin son dies. We have the problem of finding a place to bury that rabbit. We have them traveling together along with some bears that we meet who have their own little story. They end up at the house of Virginia the Woolf. This was part of my pulling in authors. I started reading a variety of suicide notes, or suicide stories in some case. So Hart Crane, this is Hart Crane as a rabbit. This is a Hart Crane poem. Hart Crane jumped off a boat in 1932 and died. Didn't leave a note, but there's enough of the story that we can think about what happened. Virginia Woolf, of course, walked into a river and died. And so I became interested in reading these as ways of thinking through death and through suicide for my characters. And I started to create characters around them. So Hart Crane and Virginia the Woolf exist in this fairy tale world that Mr. Finn is kind of watching emerge. And they, in various ways, they speak or think or feel through mutations or transformations of text from these authors. So I've taken aspects of this poem and several other Hart Crane poems to create some of his dialogue and some of his kind of mental processing. And I've taken aspects from Virginia Woolf's novel, The Waves, and given, did I say Virginia the Woolf? I said Virginia Woolf. And given Virginia the Woolf this kind of dual existence as somehow internally the self, the writer that we kind of know somewhere in her subconscious, but externally she is an author of huge fantasy novels, and she's very famous and popular. But she's also a wolf. So let's see a bit of that, and then I think I'll be done talking at you here. So this first paragraph is various permutations and transformations of some of Woolf's text, or Virginia Woolf's text from The Waves, and then it changes. The sun sinks. One sees landscapes encircling creatures who want only to leave this cold night. I have resisted grain and water enough to die before the week is out. I disperse like angels around a grave. Solemn rail, it sheds black hair, such feet, such a purse, hairy cheeks, a pacifist chin before a banquet of dust. In slippery satin sea-gree women condemn me, a square upon the oblong. Here are the stones that wither beside the smooth stream where fish sink, sea-smitten, almost gods, bearing fruit and blossom. I take them from you, mended to the sky and to the distant shores, my fortune of stones. I watch the cool wells, I walk the roads. I will remain in this landing between stairs, looking out upon dead lands where nothing moves. I will hold on, I will not let go. I will consume and be consumed. From the air that forms in the heart of the earth into the air that forms the breath of me, I cast my stones, my curses. Virginia the Wolf was a fractal. If one looked closely, if one were able, at the composition of her flesh, one would find them. Hundreds, millions of wolfish jaws gaping, and there in their throats a veritable plague of bacteria like Virginia's, smaller than small and wandering about, prowling and sinister ornaments that knew all she knew, waiting in their own wild orbits. Every moment a nation of them was sloughed off, scraped against a wall, shaken into the distance when she was cold, when she scratched, and they formed infinitesimal piles of life all over the house and grounds. Every moment, yet they would never be used up. The whole world might already be filled with her, inside and out. Our rabbit family ends up at her house at some point. So they're hanging out. Most of the rabbits are sort of non-beings, except for the eldest sister. So they're sort of like dumb rabbits. This is Virginia. How nice it was to have a house nearly to herself. Just all those little sleeping bunnies without troubles or worries, dreaming of shiny things, hiding places, the ticking of clocks, warm blankets. They were so simple. The more she thought of them, the more she was reminded of the old days, the very old days, when she was a he who roamed the woods. Living and dying were easy games then, and she spent half her time concocting ways to make her task difficult, complex, beautiful. Virginia said to herself, no, deeper. The self she would have spoken to spoke it to another, still further within, or again another step down in an almost private, shapeless language, spoke to its quiet sister, mother, or daughter, the one without eyes, without skin, without lips or breath, but only ears. Gray the landscape, dim the ashes, water that murmurs and moves. If I fall on my knees, if I go through the ancient antics, it's you, unknown figures, you I adore. I've hidden you all this time in the hope that somehow you'd disappear, or better still emerge, as indeed you must, if the story is to go on gathering richness and rotundity, destiny and tragedy, as stories should. I sit, she said. The moon came in upon her knees. The moon comes in upon my knees, she said. She felt a peace come upon her again, and in that the characters, the fantastical city, all the pieces of story floated, suspended in liquid calm, resolution. All were without desire. She needn't make them move again, never pluck them from the bath and stuff them with motives, power, vengeance, guilt, lust. Never string them together with her desires. They rested safely in their motionless world, unwritten. I am the narrator, said her head. I am the narrator, it said again. She had used the phrase the night before to draw her listeners in, to treat them to her godlike presence. Now the phrase pronounced itself, less her voice, but some other being coming toward her. I am the narrator. I can tell you certain things about your daughter, about last night, and all the others before it. I can resurrect moments for you. These moments will become you and her and the night, and the more you listen, the more you remember, the more you forget. You are overcome by the story. I am the narrator, a constant storm of attention. The voice went on and on. Where was her quietude? I sit, she said again. The moon lays prone across my lap. And a bit later, Virginia has not been doing well. And here's what happens. In the morning, there was one less bunny. Virginia chose what she felt was the stupidest among them. She would not yet devour the intelligent, though the old urges felt the same regardless. She knew she might eat them all if they stayed for very long. Uncooked, delicious, struggling just a bit. There had been no chase, no cleverness, no disguises. She had opened the door, observed the slow rising and falling, pulsing forms, could see their softness, could smell the days of worry still in their fur. Oh, the smell. When she pulled back the blanket, it was like opening an oven door, the trapped aromas of the body, its outsides and its insides, wafted up sharply and then hovered, heady and complex. The conjunction of this sweet waiting meal and the delight of observing one's own child sleeping just the same way, with the same rich smells. This did not escape her. It drove her on. We say to our children, "I could eat you up." Virginia the wolf ate up the bunny child, adoringly, thinking of her very own daughter. Waking, the bunny must have felt Virginia's grip, perhaps saw her eye, her teeth, her ears, her nose, but the terror was quick and confused. What a perfect way to die. Not oblivious, but not in prolonged dread, secure in the half-self of waking, then crushed by perfect jaws, crushed by the infinite. She left no evidence. She had the spare bed removed and the others shifted to hide the gap, but it would not have mattered. What would one expect from a wolf? And who would stop her? To eat a few lost bunnies seemed, all things considered, harmless. And the feeling it gave her was irresistible, and she immediately craved another, as if they all belonged together inside her, as if she would be doing them a favor. Thank you. So maybe you have questions or comments? Or?
So I'm interested in what you were saying about not taking possession of your family's lives, but still wanting to write it out, I guess. And it seems like how you use the old man as your Proteus and the way, and like Virginia the wolf. I don't know if it's the right word, but maybe it's allegory. Is that? If you could talk a little bit about allegory, and also the thing about not wanting to possess them. You also said being found is much like being dead, and I wonder about the containment of feeling like something is actually found, or that is it within sight, or is it something that you're holding when you find it? That's more of a.
Yeah, I think I'll start there, and then I'll try to track back to the other questions. Yeah, so my feeling, and it's not necessarily my philosophy for anyone else, but my feeling in relation to life stories, I guess, is I guess it's a fancy way of saying better left untold or unresolved or left untidy, right? I think. And I think the spirit of it is also in that last bit, that narrator speaking, saying, I can tell you about it, I can tell you your memories back to you, I can record them for you, explain them for you, make sense of everything. And I think in doing that, we lose a lot, right? So I wanted to, I guess in thinking about people in my family, two things. I wanted to approach it without pretending to understand it, approach things without losing my own confusion or my own unknowing, my own sense of mystery. I also didn't want to pretend to know more of them or about them than I did. just as a matter of respect, I guess. So that's a kind of respect. I guess another part of it is maybe this is, I think there's another way of thinking about this is that it's very selfish, which is that I only wanted to be interested in my part of it, perhaps, right? The sort of, what is this to me, right? I wanted to maintain that distance, maybe out of selfishness, maybe out of a sense that that's all I get anyway out of this sort of thing, out of this sort of questioning. Is that adding to it?
Can I respond a little?
Yeah, please.
There's a couple different ways that I've thought about this kind of writing, because I want to write about things, but it's hard to write directly.
Uh-huh.
And I in Calvino's essays, he talks about how when he tries to write about his own life, he kind of becomes like putrefied,
Yeah.
and then he has to use Medusa in order to like write around it.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
but then there's other ways of thinking about how writing is a way where you could write yourself into someone else's perspective that you would never actually
Mm-hmm.
have otherwise.
Right.
So it seems like is it ethical in that, like, is it an ethical question? Is a question.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I don't know. Yeah, that sort of
Yeah.
putrefaction, but the opportunity to
Yeah.
totally envelop yourself in another
Yeah, which
potentially imaginary or like
Yeah.
not real.
Yeah, which I think maybe puts us to wonder what that would mean anyway, right? And I think to me this gets back to the artificiality of literature and literary practices, and I think Calvino is kind of there with us in the sense that it's in its artificiality that literature most resembles reality, which is to say, when we try to force the resemblance, when we try to make the resemblance sort of really strongly coherent. In essence, when what I think of as sort of conventional realism tries to make this easy correspondence, it has to dumb down life to do that, right? Can't help it. So I think the more we seek out ways of making literature as itself richer, more complicated, less kind of obsessed with truths or fundamentals or realities, it starts to look more like how life feels, right? And that it's an uneasy look-alike, right? It's an uneasy correspondence between literature and life. It's one that you can't just sort of then, I'm not saying it then becomes easy to match them up. I'm saying the difficulty of matching them up is the difficulty of living in the world, right? Yeah. Right. Yeah.
I'm interested in all this mapping work that you did, trying to track your various themes and intersections and how things were connecting.
Okay.
So it seems like you were trying to make those connections more, I guess, visible or legible to yourself. And I'm wondering how you were thinking about those connections being visible or legible to the external, the reader,
Mm-hmm.
and one, if you were even worried about that at all, if you had ways to try to see it from an outside perspective, or if you just had like a measure of faith.
Yeah. Yeah, probably all that. I think, right, because the hardest part is being a reader to yourself, right? And trying to see your words, having forgotten what you did to write them or what was going on in your head when you wrote them. I think a couple practical techniques. I think mapping is a version of this, just sort of like, okay, I'll start making a kind of spatial list of things and see what that looks like. What are the connections that I think are there? What is a shape that I might give it that might, like ideally when you create a map like that, you create it with enough kind of intentional use of space and design that you just see the empty spaces, right? That they just appear out of the sort of something missing in the design, kind of like the periodic table, right? We just see, oh, there's probably an element that does this, right? So something like that in the mapping. Other ways that I think, for me, are pretty fun are, well, a simple one is getting off the screen, getting it off 8.5 by 11 paper. For some people, like putting it into a Kindle device. Like you start to see it the way you see other published works. And my usual response is like, well, this is crappy. Who published this garbage, right? This doesn't make any sense. Or I've started using things like Lulu or Amazon's on-demand publishing. You can just kind of make a book of a manuscript, and that too gives you some of that critical distance, that sense of a foreign object that didn't come from your hands. And there's something, again, even in boring old literature that does what it's supposed to do on each page, and there are no tricks. The space of the book, all of our bodily attractions to the book and our physical relationship to it, all that stuff makes a pretty profound difference in creating that imaginative space that you want to try to notice, right? In order to see what's going on for a potential reader. So, I mean, the other part of the question is, at some point I had to care, right? I think part of my practice, like when you see all those pages on the wall, the little mini pages, part of what I did a lot with this novel was just move shit around, right? Just say, well, what if this is the beginning, right? And it's like taking a mobile, right? And just grabbing a different top piece, and seeing how everything falls when you've grabbed it. And so trying to do that over and over and over again until I start to see the whole thing as a bit more fluid, maybe. And that allows a kind of re-entry into like, okay, here's this part, this is how it might feel, or this is what's gonna like come out of this for a reader. So I guess, those are sort of little tricks for getting a little bit of that distance, and the mapping too is that way of just trying to kind of rehearse things in my head and then go back to the text and see, am I doing what I said I was doing? Sometimes I'd map something out, or okay, this is embarrassing. Like especially while driving, you might try like interviewing yourself as if you're all done and people think it was, like someone's like, so why did you write this book? Oh, well, why did and how did you come up with the Hart Crane character? What's that all about? Why doesn't he? It's like, oh, well. And you just try to give that answer that you would expect from a smart person. And suddenly you're like, oh, shit, I have no idea. But here's an idea. Like, here's what a smart person would say about a book that was good, right? Maybe I should do that, right? So try it. Other questions? Comments? You in the front.
I was just going to return to something that Mary Jane brought up. When you made your comment, I was brought to mind of something that Virginia Woolf said about, I think about literary modernism, that the war forced us to put everything at an angle from ourselves. We had to, something like, I'm paraphrasing, but we had to put our emotions at an angle. And it's the bombs, really. There's a way in which one way to think about literary modernism, Beckett, who was very also affected by the war in his writing, is that in one way, formally, it is a response to bombings, right? To the explosions of the wars. So there's the allegorical, but there's also maybe this need to push form away in some sense. Yeah. And so I was really struck when you said that. I suddenly remembered the Zeppelin in the story, and you're kind of almost rooting your novel in the modernist relation to the bomb, which of course that story must be. Can you talk a little bit about that story? It feels like a children's story that's about surviving a bombing. Right. Must have been written by somebody who'd lived through the war and so forth.
Yeah, and can you imagine for young children like this? Is, what should we write about? How about mice and they get bombed?
Right.
Yeah. Get bombed. Mice just. And the sense of they just get wasted. The insufficiency of these other forms, right? The sense that like these don't do what they used to do, or they feel stale or dead, or they're incapable of articulating something about this new experience, right? The allegorical piece there in this novel then is, of course, I said these are this is from like bedtime stories between Mr. Finn and his son, but they're not the right stories, right? They're the characters, but this is not what was supposed to happen, right? So that's the piece of like war is not, in a sense, war is not supposed to happen, right? Despite it happening over and over again, right? There's always a sense of like, this is not supposed to be this way. And so in the structure of Mr. Finn's experience, he's finding these stories kind of coming back in his memory, but all wrong, right? Without heroes, without shape, with loss of a child instead of like the success of all children and the adventure of being without your parents. All of that is kind of lost, and so the new forms that emerge are all I suddenly think of the like. This seems cheap. I think of how the body is so good and bad at healing, right? That wounds, scabs, swellings, like all these things are recurring things in the text in a way. How do things get injured? What do things do when they're under attack? The bears are somehow the offspring of trees. One of the bears has an ant infestation living in its body. Its mother, covers it with tree sap and stuffs it full of ground up leaves and all kinds of like this. So the healing process is grotesque. The infection is grotesque. Life is full of these kind of grotesque ways of dealing with trauma, dealing with injury, right? And in some sense, that seems like a really negative way of characterizing modernist literature, but as a kind of survival mechanism, as a kind of healing, as a kind of reaction, as a scar, as a scab, as a way of cutting into our mental space, our kind of way of narrating life and thinking through language. Yeah. Is there one more question? Or?
Since a lot of your stories are kind of rooted in like Western literature and like these other characters, I'm wondering if you could speak to maybe like what that says about like who can interpret the work or like who the work's for.
Yeah, that's a good question. I guess part of what one always, okay, maybe the short answer is like I don't care, which is maybe a bad way to answer. But there aren't that many of them. I'm not going to sell 1 million copies, so less than 1 million people is fine. This is one of the things about then like making your own books, right? Like that book I showed you that was kind of the layers of text, the big red letters or whatever. I made 5 of them, and making 5 of them is great because I think only 5 people have to like this on the whole planet, right? Like how can I even begin to care about what someone else might want or how to kind of sort of normalize it or generalize it to an open audience. So it was very much. An audience that would care. But it's also, what I love about reading, and should I narrate this? My early experience of being a reader is I went from probably the first, from reading life was at 5 years old, let's say, to 12 years old, mostly Spider-Man comics, right? That's what I read. And then after that, I read the Brothers Karamazov, and Kafka and Beckett, and I just sort of jumped like, screw this stuff, I'm going to read something big. And I skipped, my parents thought I was going to be a really bad kid, right, because I wasn't reading all the things that teach you values as I was just reading Spider-Man. But I just sort of made the leap, and part of the leap was the first page of Brothers Karamazov, there's an allusion to Ophelia, right? I said, what the hell's Ophelia, right? So I went and asked my dad, what's Ophelia? How did Father Karamazov's wife die Ophelia-like? Right, that's the line. And my dad said, that's a Shakespeare character, and he couldn't place it for the moment. It's like, okay, now I got to go look through Shakespeare. So I'm looking all through Shakespeare trying to find Ophelia. I find Ophelia, and now I've got to read Hamlet to understand this one allusion in this text. simultaneously I'm reading, I guess I'm still reading comic books. A comic book has a reference to Waiting for Godot. So I'm like, okay, I gotta go read Waiting for Godot. And stupid me, I thought to understand anything, I had to know exactly what it was talking about and get all the references, all the allusions, and like be really like fully engaged in that way. So this was my construct for reading, that reading is this kind of, I like the word labyrinth, right? Reading is this kind of labyrinth of possibilities, right? And there are multiple paths every step of the way, and these allusions and references form all these paths. I mean, there are things that I slip in there that are like, maybe they're just games for me, or they're tracking some reader who might get it. So for instance, Virginia the Woolf, well, what do I have to take account of there? Well, who's afraid of Virginia the Woolf, right? What's that about? Anyone remember? Who's afraid of Virginia the Woolf? You remember. Who's afraid of Virginia the Woolf? This couple, it's a almost retired academic. Maybe it was his retirement party. I don't know, whatever. They invite this younger couple over to dinner, and they just like freak them out. They're arguing with each other, and then they start inventing things, like inventing, our son, our dead son, right? So I'm like, oh, look, there's my novel again, right? So I'm doing the same thing. I'm following these labyrinths as a writer, and yeah, I don't care if you know that in a way. I mean, so I guess another answer is like, can someone enjoy it, I guess, or get anything out of it? I don't care if you enjoy it either, I guess, but can you get something out of it without knowing all these references? And yeah, I've had people read it who don't realize that Hart Crane is a person, is a poet. But what's waiting in there for someone is like, they'll stumble upon it someday. Be like, oh, Hart Crane. I thought that was a character in that stupid novel I read. It's actually a real poet. I'm going to find out a little more about him. And so there's kind of this fantasy for me of books being these little nodes of much more expansive kinds of processes that aren't just about reading a single text, but about being wrapped up in lots of text, which does, as you say, it kind of requires the presence of an accessible tradition, right? So playing with it and yeah, absolutely, like limiting my audience every step of the way, right? Yeah, which is fine. Yeah. Out of time.